We have all been taught that before God said, "Let there be light," there was only darkness and an empty, formless void. But what if that wasn't the beginning? What if it was the aftermath of a catastrophic end? What if the story of creation as we know it is missing its first and most terrifying chapter? Imagine a world that existed before our own, an earth not waiting to be born, but one already ancient, recovering from a judgment so complete it was nearly erased from all memory. This is the secret that ancient sages and early church fathers feared to speak aloud, the story of a pre-Adamic civilization, beings of immense stature and purpose, who walked this planet in a forgotten age. This isn't just a matter of hidden history. The truth of this lost world redefines the very nature of the spiritual war we find ourselves in today. It suggests that the great conflict between light and darkness did not begin with a serpent in a garden, but in the ruins of a creation that came before, a world that committed an offense so profound it caused God to press the reset button on reality itself. The evidence for this has been hiding in plain sight, concealed within the original Hebrew of the Bible and in sacred texts that were deliberately set aside. If you are someone who seeks the deeper truths, the knowledge that has been kept in the shadows, then stay with me. What we are about to uncover will not only challenge what you've been taught, it will illuminate why the battle for the human soul is far older and more desperate than you ever imagined. The story, we are told, begins with Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. "And the earth was without form, and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." We accept these words as the description of a beginning. But what if the most critical detail was lost in translation? The original Hebrew word for was, haya *, can also mean became. Think about that. The earth became a ruin. It wasn't created that way. This single word transforms the very foundation of our understanding. It suggests not a beginning, but a recovery. Why is this important? Because centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah was given a vision of God's devastating judgment. And to describe the utter desolation, he used the exact same, incredibly rare Hebrew phrase, "I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void." Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23. Why would a prophet describe a future judgment using the precise words for the beginning of creation, unless the beginning we read about was actually the aftermath of a judgment that came before? This points to a silent, unwritten gap between the first two verses of the Bible. A chasm of time between God's perfect creation in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and the chaotic, watery ruin of Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. Early theologians, men who studied the original texts, saw this clearly. They understood that something catastrophic must have occurred in that hidden interval. Something so profound it required a complete remaking, a divine reset. An entire world, a prior creation, could be buried in that silence. A world populated by beings who walked the earth in an age we have forgotten. Their story wasn't just lost. It seems it was deliberately erased. The question that should haunt every believer is not whether they existed, but what they could have possibly done to provoke a judgment so complete that God would flood their world in darkness and start over. What was their original sin? The clues to this forgotten age are not found in our modern Bibles alone. We must look to the fringes, to the texts that were debated, discussed, and then quietly set aside. Ancient Jewish traditions, fragments from rabbinic commentaries, and even echoes in books like the Book of Jubileus, all speak of a time before our time. They are the missing pieces of a puzzle that the ancient world knew how to assemble, but that we have long since forgotten. These are not separate, conflicting stories. They are the missing context for Genesis. They are the memories that fill the silent chasm between a perfect creation and a chaotic ruin. These traditions describe a world not empty, but full, an earth teeming with life, light, and beings of a different order. Close your eyes and imagine it for a moment. An earth without man, yet not without inhabitants. A world bathed in a light we have never seen, ruled by entities created for a purpose we can no longer remember. But this knowledge was deemed dangerous. The ancient sages, the very guardians of the holy texts, feared these revelations. They worried that knowing about the catastrophic failure of a prior creation would raise terrifying questions about our own. So the story was obscured. The details were buried deep in commentary and tradition. The memory of this first Earth was intentionally allowed to fade into darkness. If you feel compelled to continue this journey into what was lost, consider subscribing so you don't miss the revelations to come. This raises the most critical question of all. These pre-Adamic beings were not human, so what were they? The Bible gives us a clue, a name associated with light, wisdom, and music. And their leader was the most magnificent being God had ever created, an anointed cherub who walked in the very garden of God on a holy mountain of fire. His story, you see, did not begin with a fall from heaven. It began with the ruin of his own world. The version of the story we are never told is one of a world bathed in a light that was not from our sun, a kingdom given in stewardship to God's most perfect creation, the anointed cherub. The prophet Ezekiel gives us a glimpse of this being, walking, quote, upon the holy mountain of God, in the midst of the stones of fire. This wasn't a metaphor for a heavenly realm. Ancient tradition suggests this was the description of a physical earth, a primordial kingdom where the veil between the spiritual and the material was almost non-existent. A world governed by a being of unimaginable beauty and wisdom, known then as the Light-Bearer. But perfection, when given free will, contains the seed of its own undoing. This great cherub, this guardian of a perfect world, looked upon his own reflection and saw a rival to his Creator. The first sin was not an apple, but an ambition whispered in the heart of the Light-Bearer. I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. This was not just a spiritual rebellion. It was a cosmic treason. He sought to corrupt his dominion, to turn God's earthly masterpiece into his own dark kingdom, influencing the very beings who served under his authority. This is the great omission, the secret that changes everything. The cataclysm that left the earth without form and void was not an accident of nature. It was the deliberate and righteous judgment of God, a global flood of darkness and water, not to destroy but to cleanse. To bury a corrupted world order so deeply that it would be forgotten by time. The 6 days of creation we read about were not a beginning from nothing, but a divine restoration from the ruins of a rebellion. God was not creating, He was recreating. But in His infinite sovereignty, God did not simply erase this first world. He sealed it. The darkness upon the face of the deep was more than an absence of light. It was a prison. The waters were a barrier, holding back an ancient evil, a memory of a world that chose pride over its Creator. This is why the spiritual war feels so ancient, so deeply embedded in the fabric of our world. Because the ruins of that first rebellion were never truly gone. They became the foundation upon which our own world was built, and something was left behind, waiting in the deep. This is the point where the story you were taught in Sunday school diverges sharply from the one buried in the archives of history. The traditional narrative is simple, clean. God created the heavens and the earth, and it was a new beginning. But this hidden version speaks of a restoration, a second chance, a world built upon the ruins of a cosmic failure. Why would this truth be concealed? The answer is as simple as it is unsettling: fear. Think of the early church councils, the gatherings at Nicaea, at Hippo. These were men of God, tasked with a monumental burden, to forge a unified doctrine from a vast collection of sacred texts, oral traditions, and divine revelations. They had to decide what was foundational and what was complicated. The story of a pre-Adamic world, of a rebellion led by God's most perfect creation, was not just complicated, it was spiritually volatile. It raised questions they believed the average believer was not equipped to handle. Questions about the nature of evil, the sovereignty of God, and the true age of the spiritual war. So a choice was made. A silent, unwritten decision to favor a simpler narrative. They chose the story of a new beginning over the more difficult truth of a divine recovery. Texts that hinted too strongly at this forgotten age, like the Book of Jubileus or certain rabbinic commentaries, were relegated to the margins. Not necessarily declared false, but labeled as apocryphal, hidden away. It was a strategy of spiritual protection, an attempt to build the church on a foundation of simple, unshakable truths. But in doing so, they inadvertently buried a revelation that explains so much about the world we live in today. This knowledge was deemed a threat to order. It suggested that evil was not a new intruder in the Garden of Eden, but an ancient landlord with a prior claim to the territory. It implied that the darkness God separated from the light was not just a physical phenomenon, but a conscious, defeated entity sealed beneath creation. If you believe this hidden history deserves to be brought back into the light, share this video with someone who seeks the deeper truths of our faith. Because the most terrifying part of this story isn't that a world was destroyed. It's what the Bible quietly tells us was left behind in the ruins. The Bible tells us that when God separated the waters, He created a firmament, a barrier. But what was He holding back? The traditional answer is simply water. But ancient texts suggest it was something far more terrifying. The, quote, deep, or estadeshk in Hebrew, was not just an ocean, it was a prison. A holding place for the disembodied spirits of that first corrupted creation. The entities who followed their leader into cosmic treason. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 19 speaks of Christ preaching to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient. Who were these spirits if not the casualties of a war that predates Adam? But this is not the most shocking revelation. The seal God placed upon that ancient ruin was perfect, but the memory was not entirely erased. The echoes of that first world, its forbidden knowledge, and its immense power, bled through the veil of time. This is a truth that almost no one dares to speak. The spiritual war we fight is not against invaders from another realm. It is against the lingering shadows of the world that came before ours, ancient landlords who refuse to relinquish their claim on this planet. Think of the strange and unsettling accounts of giants in the Old Testament, the Nephilim. We are taught they were the offspring of fallen angels and human women after the time of Adam. But what if that was only part of the story? What if their origins were far older? A genetic and spiritual echo of the beings who populated the pre-Adamic world. A corruption re-emerging from the very dust of the earth. Let us know in the comments if you have ever felt that the story of the giants was deeper and more ancient than we have been told. And this leads to the final, most unsettling question. God formed Adam from the dust of the ground. But if that ground was the reclaimed ruin of a world judged for its profound wickedness, what was in that dust? What ancient memory, what spiritual DNA was passed from that first fallen creation into the very being of mankind? The serpent in the garden did not introduce a new temptation. He simply reawakened a very old one, an ambition that was already sleeping in the foundations of our world. This is the point where the story can feel overwhelming, even dangerous, a truth so vast it threatens to shatter the simple foundations of our faith. But this hidden knowledge was never meant to bring fear. It was meant to bring understanding. It doesn't diminish God's plan. It reveals its true, breathtaking scale. This revelation shows that our existence is not a random beginning, but a deliberate, divine response to a cosmic tragedy. Think about it. Humanity was not Plan A. We are God's answer to the failure of a previous creation. Adam was not placed in a pristine, untouched world. He was placed on reclaimed ground, a battlefield that had been cleansed but still bore the scars of a war fought in an age before time was measured. Our purpose, therefore, was never simply to exist. It was to succeed where the light-bearer and his followers had failed. We were created to be the rightful heirs to a kingdom they tried to steal. This understanding does not weaken the story of salvation, it magnifies it. The coming of Christ was not just a rescue mission for humanity. It was the ultimate act of reclamation for a world that had been corrupted twice. His sacrifice on the cross was a final, decisive victory in a war that began in the darkness before Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. He didn't just conquer the sin of Adam, he conquered the ancient pride that first plunged a perfect world into chaos. And this brings us to the heart of the entire mystery. God did not send Adam into this ancient spiritual conflict defenseless. He gave him a specific authority, a divine commission that was so powerful, the serpent's first and only priority was to sabotage it. This was Adam's true forgotten purpose, a mandate that, had it been fulfilled, would have forever sealed the ruins of that first world. And what that mandate was, is the final secret that has been kept from us. The command given to Adam in the garden was not a gentle suggestion, it was a battle plan. We read the words in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it." We have been taught this was a call to agriculture and family, but the original Hebrew reveals a far more profound, far more urgent commission. The word for replenish implies filling something that was once full and has been emptied, and the word for subdue is kabosh, a military term. It means to tread down, to conquer, to bring a hostile territory into submission. Adam's forgotten purpose was not to tend a garden. It was to be a warrior king, tasked with reconquering a world that still echoed with the rebellion of its first inhabitants. The serpent knew this. The entire temptation in the garden was a strategic masterstroke to disarm humanity before we ever understood the war we were created to fight. The enemy's goal was not to make Adam sin, but to make him forfeit his divine authority. By disobeying, Adam didn't just fall from grace, he surrendered his mandate. He handed the dominion of a world he was meant to reclaim back to the very entity who had corrupted it in the first place. The fall of man was the failure of a divine mission, a mission to finally and forever cleanse the earth of its ancient shadows. But the story does not end in failure. Where the first Adam failed, the second Adam triumphed. Jesus Christ did not come to earth merely to teach and to heal. He came as a conqueror, to finish the mission that was abandoned in the garden. His life was a campaign of reclamation. His death on the cross was not a defeat, it was the ultimate act of subduing the enemy. He descended into the deep, into that ancient prison, and declared victory over the spirits that were disobedient from the beginning. His resurrection was the final planting of God's flag on reclaimed territory. This is the truth that illuminates everything. Your faith is not an escape from the world. It is your enlistment in its restoration. The spiritual war is real because the ground beneath our feet is contested territory. But the battle has already been won. The light that God spoke into the darkness of Genesis is the same light that shone from an empty tomb, a light that no ancient darkness can ever overcome. If this revelation has deepened your understanding of the great story you are a part of, subscribe and join us as we continue to uncover the truths that have been hidden in plain sight. For in Christ we are not just saved from the ruins, we are empowered to rebuild. This revelation changes everything. It reframes God's entire plan, not as a simple story of creation and fall, but as a grand, cosmic epic of rebellion, judgment, and divine reclamation. Your life, your faith, your very existence are not an afterthought. You are the definitive answer to the greatest failure in cosmic history. The story of humanity is the story of God entrusting His most precious project, the restoration of a fallen world, to beings made in His own image, beings capable of succeeding where the most powerful angel failed. Perhaps you have always sensed this. Perhaps you have sat in a church pew and felt that the simple stories, while true, were missing a crucial dimension of depth and urgency. This knowledge is not for the spiritually complacent. It is for the seekers, for those who have felt the echoes of this ancient war in their own souls and have yearned for a truth that matches the scale of the battle they feel raging around them. This revelation wasn't kept from you because you couldn't handle it, It was preserved for a time when you would be ready to receive it. This is why so much of modern faith can feel hollow, a mile wide and an inch deep. We have been trying to understand our purpose without knowing our history. We have been taught that the spiritual battle began with a whisper in a garden, when in reality, we were born onto the reclaimed soil of a battlefield. This lack of context is the source of our spiritual unease. It is the reason why evil often seems so ancient, so entrenched, and so deeply woven into the fabric of the world. We have been fighting an ancient enemy without understanding the true origin of the war. But knowing this does not bring despair, it brings clarity. It explains the ferocity of the temptation, the depth of the world's darkness, and the absolute necessity of Christ's victory. Your personal struggles are not random. They are skirmishes on the front lines of a conflict that began before time. You were created for this. You were placed here, in this moment, as a restorer, a reclaimer, and a living testament to the fact that God's second chance was his greatest triumph. Your faith is not a passive belief, it is your active commission in the reclamation of all things. So take a moment, let this profound truth settle in your spirit. This is not just ancient history, it is your spiritual inheritance, the forgotten prologue to your own story. You were not created for a simple life, in a simple world. You were created to be the answer to a cosmic rebellion, the living proof that God's plan of restoration is more powerful than the deepest, oldest darkness. For centuries, this understanding remained in the shadows, a truth deemed too challenging, too vast for the masses. It was whispered in the margins of sacred texts, preserved by the few who dared to look beyond the veil. But we are living in a time of revelation, a time when what was hidden is being brought into the light. God is restoring the knowledge that was lost, equipping his people for the final chapters of this great story. If this truth burns in your heart, if you feel the weight and the glory of what has been revealed today, let us know by leaving a like. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you do not miss the truths we are yet to uncover together. And now, we have a members area. By becoming a member, you bless this work and help us continue producing, edifying, and revealing content like this, becoming a true partner in this ministry. Finally, we want to see how far the light of this restored truth is reaching. In the comments below, please write where you are watching from, so that we may see the community of seekers God is gathering from every corner of the earth. You are not alone in this search. The story is bigger than you ever imagined, and your part in it has just begun.